I'd like to welcome Glenn Kenneally on stage. And Glenn's daughter Anna has had eczema since she was a baby, and she's now 11 years old. She's doing really well. I think she's here today. So Glenn has lots of experience of coping with the condition, and I guess Glenn and your wife, you're experts now in your own right. I'm sure a lot of what Professor Irvine had to say today you can relate to, and you can fully understand after all the years. Paul Herriott also joins us, and Paul is a really vocal patient advocate as someone who has lived with atopic eczema. And I know there are lots of names as well for, and I'm speaking as someone who's not an expert, but there are lots of names. We've heard atopic dermatitis, AD, atopic eczema. Maybe for the purpose of this discussion, we'll just say eczema or whatever everyone is happy with. But Paul has his own experience. He's lived his life with eczema, and once he talks, you'll know he has a voice for radio as well, because of course he's a broadcaster with Ortiz Lyric FM. So he'll talk a little bit about. Pardon?
I've often heard that.
That's great. But Paul as well will, I guess, share his experience of trying to manage it in adult life and through your job and work and personal experiences. So look, discussing this, I'm really bearing in mind that a lot of people who've been asking the questions, I sense, are parents as well who've been living with this. So Glenn, I suppose to turn to you first on this. It is very common in children, and I was surprised to see that it can affect up to 1 in 5 children in Ireland. Of course, they're all different degrees of severity. So if you tell us a little bit about your story, about Anna's story, when her eczema symptoms began to emerge, and how affected she was by the condition.
Yeah, I suppose she was 6 months old when it first appeared, and just saw red patches on the backs of her knees. And of course, we took her to the GP, and we went through all the usual, went from different strength to strength on the steroids, moisturizers, but it gradually got worse and worse, and it progressed to the point where about 90% of her body was really covered. It was quite sore, itchy all the time. It affected life completely. I mean, at its worst, her face would have looked like she was really badly burned, I suppose. And she was just constantly uncomfortable with it, really. The family life, I suppose, people here would probably go through the same thing and would know that it affects the whole family, really, because nobody's getting any sleep. You can't do simple things like go on a car journey without somebody in the back seat comforting her and holding her hands. You can't go on sun holidays because the heat was affecting her. Yes, small things like that. But even couldn't bring her to swimming pools. At night time, one of us would always have to be holding her hand and comforting her. So we'd probably getting 1 hour of sleep at a time is probably as best as you could hope for. And her sleep was obviously affected. So we were worried that her development was going to be affected by that, because, you know, her energy was going into fighting this condition, and she wasn't getting the sleep that she needed, so she was a little bit smaller, I suppose, at that age than most other kids, but she's after catching up now, definitely, anyway. But
and you talked there, Glenn, about, you know, that you couldn't go on sun holidays or to hot countries because the heat affected the eczema. And we had a question earlier on today about, you know, in some instances people are okay with it. It depends on the individual. Did you find that in terms of triggers, like you mentioned the swimming pool as well, that these were things that was trial and error on your part, or you would suddenly understand this has caused this flare-up, right, this is off the list of what we can do now?
It was really difficult to pinpoint anything, because sometimes it could just flare up for no apparent reason. And, you know, as I said, we went through every single steroid going, but it was really difficult to pinpoint any one particular thing. Obviously some things like, you know, a swimming pool, and the heat was something that aggravated it. But apart from those obvious things, there was nothing. Day to day, there was general, very normal things that people would just have flare-ups, and we wouldn't, you know, we'd just be used to it, really, I suppose. I mean, at the worst of it, we're looking back on it now. We just looked at a video of Anna recently when she was at her worst, and because it's a number of years ago now, we'd forgotten how difficult it was. And, you know, it was so normal for us at the time that she was so uncomfortable and just suffering with it, and we were doing our best with it. But looking back now, we go, geez, it was really bad, you know.
And very hard with a young child when they can't articulate that pain and discomfort, but you're feeling it. You're feeling what they're going through. Yeah. And just to bring us to a turning point in Anna's treatment, or when you say you look back on videos now and you kind of can't believe how bad it was. So when was that point that you thought, it's difficult, but we're managing this now and Anna's on the right road?
Turning point for us really is when we came to Dublin and met Professor Irvine in his clinic, and I think I suppose we were lucky in a way that she was quite bad at the time, so he saw her at her worst, and I decided to treat her directly in Crumlin. So we spent 2 weeks in Crumlin at the time under Professor's care, and he started us on different treatments like wet wrapping to try and comfort her at night time. But the main thing, I suppose, was the drug treatment. We went on immunosuppressant. There was a methotrexate drug that she went on at the time. And that, within a few months, then we could see an improvement in her. And, 10 months later, I think she was really clear. And that was about the age of 3 and she's 11 now, so she's been pretty clear for the past 8 years.
That's brilliant, brilliant to hear. And your ability to manage all that and cope with that as parents and family, it's a difficult and a very stressful time, I can imagine.
It affects the whole family. I mean, we had a little girl in school at the time, and her teacher used to comment about how tired she used to be. So, I mean, everybody was affected by it.
Yeah. To come to you, Paul, you had eczema all through your childhood as well, but really your flare-up came, or you were forced to deal with it in your 40s.
Yes,
when you
yeah,
had an
definitely.
extreme flare-up. Up
I
until
came
that
from
point,
the other direction
you
in
sort
a
of
way.
self-managed, would you
Yes.
say?
I started as a child with asthma, and that cleared up when I was maybe 10 or 11, but I sort of got over that, largely got over it, but it was replaced very quickly by eczema. And it wasn't anything we really discussed then. I think that's what's changed so much in the course of my life. Probably with so many medical conditions, you didn't talk about it, and you just got on with it. Shut up and put up, really. And when I was younger, I felt I was managing. Of course, I realize now from this distance that I wasn't actually. I haven't been at one of these for a while, and it's just great to see it in context again. They say you don't know where you're going until you know where you've been, and that's so true. Listening to you today, there's not one of those experiences that I haven't had along the way. I've had every kind of treatment, and most of them have been initially really successful. Wet wrapping, for example, phototherapy, all the steroids and so on. But just like the lady said here, I had worked my way through the spectrum of all of these treatments, and particularly on that question of the steroids, through all of the steroids until really only the brown one, the Dermavate, was the one that worked. And so I'd run out of options largely, but boy, was my timing great, because the biologics had started to kick. Now, I was involved in the early days of that actually as a patient advocate with the Skin Foundation. In a way, that was a great help to me, because it allowed me to know a great deal more about my condition. That is so important. That's what's great about something like the Skin Foundation, and why I'm delighted to be involved with it occasionally, because I never had those opportunities to educate myself. That only happened in the last maybe 10 years or so. But I got to the end of the rope with all those treatments, and the biologic had come in. And in fact, it was at one of the one of the global skin conferences abroad. I think it was in Milan. And I remember there was an advocate for the Lithuanian Skin Foundation. And he was amazing. He was the best advocate you could imagine. I mean, he was like an absolute terrier with a bone, and he followed everything up. Anytime anyone said, "Are there any questions? I know where the first one's going to be coming from," and he was just amazing. And I was particularly aware of the fact that his skin was so perfect. And I said to him, "I notice you know so much about this. Your skin's perfect. Where are you coming to this from?" He said, "Well, I have terrible eczema. I'm really dreadful sufferer." I said, "Your skin is amazing. What are you on?" And he said, "I'm on the biologic." And I said,
And you said, "I'll have what you're having."
"Yeah, I'll have some of that," because I said, "I mean, that's an amazing result. What did you look like before? And he said, I look like you do now. I recommend, you get on this as quickly as possible. But the thing about it was, I felt, and I'm sure a lot of people would feel the same as you come towards that kind of systemic treatment, you do have to bear a lot of things in mind. And one of the first things that occurs to you that if you go down that route, you're probably going to be doing that for the rest of your life. That is a commitment. So naturally, there's a bit of reticence at first.
Yeah, just want to talk as well about myths and misinformation that's out there, and a lot of things that spark fear in parents or fear in people who are really trying to manage their condition. Alan, in the medical field, are you concerned about the fast cures that claim to be out there, the sort of, allergy testing and, putting the spotlight on foods and things that you should avoid, and then you will have clear skin and a well-managed condition? Are there trends that are around now that are worrying you?
There always have been in eczema, and one of the reasons these things arise is because it's a frustrating condition. Medicine has not been brilliant for most of the decades at helping, so people look elsewhere. I'd like to think we're getting a bit better, but there are lots of kind of false allergy tests, IgG allergy tests, which you'll get in pharmacies. Everyone has got IgG to foods, everybody. IgE tests are what drives allergy. And those subtleties are often lost, and you can pay hundreds of euros for false cures. And I think that just reflects people's frustration with what they've been getting maybe in the conventional space, and where their eczema or their child's eczema hasn't really been responding. So yes, there is, and for such a common condition, I think there are lots of myths. The food allergy thing is definitely one that is a real challenge for people, for kids. I think there are creams that you can order or get from shops that actually have Dermavate. Paul's brown tube, as he said, there's Dermavate in them, and they're not labelled as that because they come from not from pharmacies in Ireland. So there are lots of things that arise from time to time that the general rule, if you rub a cream on and there's no eczema, within a week, there's probably Dermavate in that, and it's just not labelled as that. And we find that lots of times with herbal cures and so on.
And are there dangers associated with that if you embark on a new treatment or something else, that you run the risk of abandoning your care plan, even if you're frustrated that maybe you're like, this isn't working for me, it's not working for my child, it's not working for my loved one? If there's a frustration there that whatever you're doing doesn't appear to be working and doesn't appear to be improving on the condition, what can you do in that instance?
Yeah, it takes a lot of work. Like, you have people in the audience and you've heard from the guys, who've lived with it or lived with their child having it. It's a huge amount of work, and not everybody gets brilliant results quickly. And it is frustrating, and it is understandable that people would reach out and find that. Hopefully some of the tips that we talked about earlier about trying to simplify and tailor it to the individual can get more people satisfied. But when you survey people, and we've done this across Europe, there's a huge amount of dissatisfaction from sufferers with eczema, whether they're adults or parents of children, that report that their treatment is not adequate. So we've a lot of work to do to help.
Glenn, as a parent, what about steroid use? Were you worried about conflicting information when it came to treating Anna? Did you have concerns around that? Of course, it's not just, as I say, parents, it's any sufferers, because I think they're looking at, what an overuse of steroids potentially, or, as I say, different conflicting information that appears to be out there about various treatments.
On the one hand, we were, but then also we were also looking at her suffering and trying to ease what she was going through. So you're weighing up what's the long-term effect on the skin against what her immediate suffering is. And, she was quite a bit of discomfort. So I was trying to ease that immediate discomfort was the main priority. And look, you put your faith in the medical staff that what you're prescribing, and it did work. So we were happy with what they were prescribing. And obviously we were listening to long-term effects of steroid creams and using it as we had to, and not overusing it, but really we had to use it to give some relief.
Paul, you've described eczema before as a very lonely condition. in that loneliness, do you think that people, reach out for fixes that promise so much? And you've talked now, obviously, about the advent of biological treatments, which are proving so effective in many people. But up until this point, when you were managing it, do you think that loneliness that comes with it and trying to manage it does leave you kind of looking, scrambling, trying to find things that will work and ease the problem?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's a great social stigma, or you feel that way about. We were talking about, the pointlessness of telling someone not to scratch. But the other thing is, people, wonder what on earth is wrong with you, and they think it's a hygiene problem or something like that. So you're fighting that as well as your condition, and so it's a sort of very much a double-edged sword in many ways. But I think that I was fortunate that I was able to have a very good line of communication with my doctors and specialists. I was very fortunate in that way, and I don't regret the fact that I was prepared to ask questions, at least, and for once actually stopped to listen to the answers. And so I was aware of the consequences of everything that I was doing, and was determined to find out as much as I could along the way. And so don't be afraid to, do your research and to ask questions when you have the opportunity, when you're with a consultant. And that in itself can be quite a long journey.
And are there tips you'd have, Alan, in the way of avoiding flare-ups in what people can do to make things easier? Because we discussed a couple of things, and including food allergies and foods to avoid. People will try and avoid, I imagine, everything that they think will prompt an adverse reaction. What would be your advice there?
Yeah, so most people can't identify why they trigger at times, or if they can, it's things that are extraneous that are very difficult to modify. Stress happens to everybody. Sleepless nights happens to everyone. Summer happens to everybody. Winter happens to everybody. And life happens to everybody. So for the majority of people, finding one or two specific triggers is actually quite difficult. Now, we do work with people and say, well, look, you're allergic to nickel, you're allergic to chrome, you shouldn't wear leather. There's some things that you can identify very clear triggers, or you're reactive to freshly cut grass. Don't try to limit your exposure to that. So there are some, but they're in the minority, people who have that awareness. And the thing is, it'll be different for everyone. And people do modify their lives around that, typically. That they know that if they go swimming in this pool, their skin will sting. If they go to this pool, it doesn't. And it can be at that level of granularity that people work it out, where it's
a very individual thing.
Yeah.
And that's very patient dependent. Glenn, I want to ask you, and we talked about all these new treatments that are coming on stream now, and the sense that the next decade is going to bring a massive jump in the area of treatment around eczema. And Anna will be coming into her teenage years. Do these new treatments offer hope? Do you feel in a way that you've sort of come out of it to a large extent, or do you believe you will be relying on those sort of treatments in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's comforting to know that there is more coming down the pipeline, as Alan was saying. But I said our treatment at the moment is minimal, just a bit of moisturising and a little bit of steroids, sometimes if a bit of dry patch of skin. But
did you ever think you'd be at that point when you talked about your 3-year-old little girl?
No, we never thought. Like, we used to worry about when she used to have to go to school and when she's a teenager and how other children are going to react to her and her parents. But obviously, by the time she started school, she was clear of it. So it was brilliant. It was a great relief. But touch wood that she will be okay in the future. But something could trigger it further down, like working environment or stress or exam stress. It's something could trigger again in the future. So it's good to know that. I'm saying that they're still working on developing treatments further that We might need again in the future. Nobody knows.
And Paul, we last talked nearly 4 years ago now. Have you, since then, have you seen a change in the treatments that are available and what has made a real difference to your condition?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm one of the great beneficiaries of this, and in more recent years, because it was during COVID that I started on the biologic. So what's that, 2 years ago now? So I'm not that long into it, might be coming up for 3. But that has been, in my case, quite transformative. It was, as I was saying earlier, I went through all those things that you go through on the route to that kind of treatment. They would work for a short or limited period. They all seem to have a shelf life. This is the thing that has been the most transformative for me. It seems a very fair exchange for one small subcutaneous injection once a fortnight. But there are side effects, as there are with every kind of drug, and that's something that you have to become aware of and familiar with. For example, with me, it's the eyes and so on. But Alan actually works with a great eye specialist who is very familiar with this drug now, and that has been a great help. But apart from that, it's just been transformative for me. I would never have believed it until I got an opportunity to try it.
The sense is, Alan, that in terms of treatment for psoriasis, we've come a huge way and huge leaps, that the condition has changed so much for people in terms of how it's managed. Do you believe we're going to see the same in terms of treatment of eczema? And 10 years from now, will we be talking about a very different experience for people, do you believe?
I think you're right. Psoriasis is maybe 10 or 15 years ahead. It's also a more consistent condition in the sense that it consistently responds to IL-23, IL-17, TNF inhibitors, and Brian Kirby will talk about these later. They typically give incredibly good results across about 10 different biologic products now. The gap in effectiveness for eczema is substantial. You know, there's a lot to make up. Even with the new biologics for eczema, there's a gap there between it and psoriasis. And one of the reasons it's a more complex, more variable, more individual condition that's triggered by lots of different things and lots of different people. And I think that I'm not sure that we can close the gap to where psoriasis is based on what I'm seeing at the moment. But I do work with companies that are having really innovative things that aren't even on the lists that I showed, that are going to require just really cool science. But I believe we'll get there. But I wouldn't like to put a timeline on it, because all those products have to be developed and tested, and there's a lag. But there's a lot of creative thinking and a lot of reason to be hopeful.
That's great. Well, I think it's good to end on a hopeful note. My thanks to Professor Alan Irvine, to Glenn Kenneally, and to Paul Herriott for joining me here to discuss this further. And I hope you, as an audience, have got a lot out of this discussion today.